It's time for a very special video. In this one we're going to be comparing the various buff characters for the Blood Angels, and see which one can get you the most out of your Death Company or Sanguinary Guard when they go in for that all-important charge. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of your miniatures on the tabletop. We've been going over the Blood Angels Codex and all of their unique units over the last few weeks, and this one will be the final video of the main series. We've looked at an absolute ton of Blood Angels characters that buff all of your Blood Angels assault infantry to make them more deadly in the close combat phase. So today we're going to be doing a side-by-side comparison of how much they can do when they jump down alongside a fighter unit of Blood Angels elites, such as Death Company or Sanguinary Guard. I know there's certainly more that we can say about the Blood Angels, and I fully intend to revisit them in future episodes. If there's anything that you can think of that would be worth covering in videos about the Blood Angels, then please let me know down in the comments, and I'll certainly put them on the list for doing at a later date. For the purposes of this video though, we'll be taking a quick look at 9 different buffing characters for the Blood Angels, what they add to the squads on the charge, and also the other positives and negatives they can bring to your army. And we'll see which one, point for point, will give you the most bang for your buck in terms of making your Death Company into the frenzied killing machines that truly make the Blood Angels a force to be feared on the tabletop. In this review we'll be covering options that have jump packs, so people who can either jump down with the assaulting elite infantry squad or can jump out to meet them to give them their buffs. I'll also be focusing on the characters that give buffs more than close combat, so I've left out things like Mephiston and the Librarian Dreadnought because I feel they're better used as missiles to charge forward towards the enemy themselves and use their spells for buffing themselves rather than friendly Blood Angels nearby. If we're looking at a pure buffing Librarian, then the standard Librarian with jump pack will generally do that better, as he costs quite a lot less points. So without further ado, let's get into it then, and we'll be looking at them one by one. So first we have the Sanguinary Priest with a jump pack. He is 70 points, and gives out a +1 strength aura. This is a massive buff to things that are strength 4, as it gets them to be strength 5, which is very important brackets for doing extra damage to certain toughness types. Now it's interesting that his buff is much more powerful against some toughness targets than others. It's useless against toughness 3, as you'll still be wounding on the same. Against toughness 4 you get a +25% boost to damage, if you're strength 4 this is. Against strength 5 it's +33%, against toughness 8 it is +50%. It has no effect at all when you're strength 4 Blood Angel against toughness 6 or 7. So in some cases it's absolutely really powerful, in some cases it's literally worthless. When you look at it on strength 8 units such as Death Company with Power Fists, generally you'll only ever be getting any mileage out of it at all on toughness 8, due to with Red Thirst you'll always wound everything else on 2s in the first round of combat. I should say for the purposes of the math hammer in this review, we're assuming that the Blood Angels are getting the benefit of Red Thirst for being in first round of close combat, but are not in their unique assault doctrine yet, so we're thinking about turn 1 or 2 charges. I have assumed that they're charging in from Deep Strike, so we'll be getting the advantage of Shock Assault and the Death Company's extra attack from Black Rage too. Back to the Sanguinary Priest. I've rated each of these characters' combat proficiency out of 5, with 1 being the weakest and 5 being the strongest. He is probably the weakest character on this list due to only being able to take a chainsword. He can certainly still cut up some infantry, but he's not going to be doing any significant damage against hard targets. He isn't particularly durable, having only 4 wounds and no invul save, but he is fairly cheap, which means his durability point for point isn't too bad. The other major thing to consider when you're taking a Sanguinary Priest is that he can also heal units as well, which is a bonus that isn't to be sniffed at, particularly on Sanguinary Guard. Next up we have the Sanguinary Ancient, who is another very interesting little model, and he's the cheapest on this list at just 66 points if you equip him how I would, with a fist and a death mask. He'll give your units reroll of 1s to wound in close combat, which will translate to a 17% buff in total damage output across every single unit. He's slightly better in close combat than the Priest due to being able to take some actual close combat gear, but he still hits on 3s and 4s with the Power Fist and doesn't have that many attacks. He's a little bit more durable than the Priest is due to his 2-up armor save, and his other perks are that he has a death mask for the -1 leadership to nearby opponents, which also can trigger some strats, and a lot more importantly in my opinion, he can take the standard of Sacrifice, which can give out a 5+ Feel No Pain type save to nearby units, which is an incredibly powerful buff, particularly on Sanguinary Guard, being 2 wound models they're ideal to have this buff. And finally he can also give you a small leadership boost too of +1 to leadership. This is really quite a lot of buffs coming from a 63 point model. His combat damage buff is very nice, but that Standard of Sacrifice buff is what can really put him through the roof in terms of value. I really like this little guy. Next we have the Sanguinor himself, who is 130 points, and his buff is to have an aura that gives +1 attacks. +1 attacks will be more use on units such as Sanguinary Guard, who have fewer attacks, and a little bit less powerful on things like Death Company, who have more attacks base, so getting 1 additional attack is proportionally less gain. So as we can see, for Sanguinary Guard he gives a flat 33% buff, and on Death Company with Chainswords it's 20%, and Death Company with Power Fists and things it's 25%. This guy is a lot better in close combat. He gives his attacks aura to himself, and he has that Oncoming Broadsword, meaning he is absolutely no slouch in close combat. He can also fall back and charge, meaning he's a great disruption piece, and he has access to the Death Mask and Stratagems too, which is just a further bonus. With this guy you are certainly paying points for a fighty character as well as his buffing presence. Moving on to Dante, who has a very similar profile indeed to the Sanguinor. In fact his durability and combat prowess are almost identical. He does cost 20 points more at 150 points, and the aura that he gives is to reroll all failed hit rolls, whether in shooting or in close combat, meaning that on a ballistic skill or weapon skill 3-up model this will equate to a 33% buff. Unfortunately, he does have the old Chapter Master wording, which means this won't work on any hits that have been failed due to modifiers, so no rerolling on 3s if you're using a Power Fist for example. He is definitely decently fighty in close combat, such as the Sanguinor. He also has access to the same Death Mask shenanigans, but I'd say his most important secondary bonus is that this 33% buff also will buff shooting as well, which is incredibly useful, as it could mean that he could be quite flexible, buffing Blood Angel shooting units as well as close combat units, or even just any shooting that your close combat unit happens to have. Death Company often have bolters, and Sanguinary Guard have those Angelus bolt guns, so getting a decent amount of extra shooting certainly isn't a bad thing. So a very powerful set of buffs, but he does come with a hefty price tag to boot. Next up we have Captains and Lieutenants, who I've both equipped with the way that I would equip a captain who's jumping in, who is mainly aiming to buff a unit. I've given them a jump pack, Power Fist and Storm Bolter, so decent shooting, decent cheap combat, and the mobility to follow their troops around and get where they need to be. The captain is 104 points with this loadout, and the lieutenant is 92. They both provide reroll 1s either to hit rolls for the captain or to wound rolls for the lieutenant, and these both math out to be plus 17% extra damage, no matter the unit it's used on. The captain is better in close combat due to his additional attacks and his much increased durability due to his Iron Halo, but he does cost a few more points for this privilege. One of the best buffing advantages that these guys have are the option to take the Quake Bolts relic from Blood of Baal. This is one of my favourite buffing options, as it will basically allow you to forego the shooting, to shoot a single bolter shot, and if it hits, then the targeted unit will have +1 to hit against it in close combat. Now obviously this won't help your entire unit if it's in combat with multiple enemy units, but you can pick one to have a +1 to hit roll against, which is an enormous damage buff. It'll be plus 25%. Against most units, provided you're hitting on a 3-up, and it only gets better if you're using something that limits your hit rolls, such as a Power Fist. If you're taking a Captain or Lieutenant purely for buffing, strongly consider this relic. As another advantage, you can also take all manner of snazzy war gear for them. You can make them into genuine smash captains by taking a Thunderhammer, and there are plenty of other shooting and melee options that you may want to consider, and Storm Shields of course. Finally, their reroll 1s buff also works in shooting as well as melee, which is certainly nice, and means it's not quite as one-dimensional as some of the buffs such as Sanguinor's +1 attack, or the Sanguinary Ancient's rerolls 1 in close combat. Next one to the Chaplains and Librarians. I've chosen to look at lemartes and astorath as opposed to the regular Chaplain with a jump pack, frankly because lemartes and astorath just give so much more benefit than the regular Chaplain does. The regular Blood Angel's Chaplain is by no means bad at all, and I really like the model, but honestly, point for point, these guys just do so much more. Lemartes is a really good value option for 100 points. His buff is to give full reroll hits for Death Company, and he will also allow them to reroll their charges and provide a litany provided he starts on the board. This all translates into a 33% damage increase when you're looking at Death Company that are hitting on 3s, and a 50% damage buff for Death Company with Power Fists or Thunder Hammers, so that's a huge buff that goes off automatically. I've not even factored his litany into this, honestly, because I'd probably be tempted by either the +2 to charge litany or the Mantra of Strength to turn him into an absolute blender in melee. You certainly could combine it with the litany that gives extra hits on 6s, or even the Blood Angel's unique litany, which gives extra AP on rolls of 6. His main downsides are that he only buffs Death Company, so I'd only really consider him if you do have Death Company to buff on the table, but being Blood Angels, most of us do. Point for point, he has very decent durability, and his combat power is solid too, particularly for a reasonably cheap character. I think that Lemartes is just all around really solid value, point for point. Next we move on to Astorath, Mr. Redeemer of the Lost, whose main melee buffs are Massive Doom, and I'd be tempted to use the Canticle of Hate to reroll all hits in melee. Massive Doom is a once per game effect that can be used to buff all Blood Angels units within 6 inches of them. On anything with a 2 or more, then they will get an additional attack, and on a 6 they get a 4-up invul as well. Now this guy took a fair bit of calculating for how much damage increase he's likely to get. The first set of numbers for Death Company and Sanguinary Guard are for if he is using Massive Doom, and the second set are for if he isn't, if he's already used it. I have taken into account the chance of failing both his Massive Doom and his litany into these numbers, and you could always use a command reroll if it's a key turn and you absolutely want to get that power off. With all of that exposition out the way, his numbers are absolutely fantastic. On average, even accounting for the chance of failure, you'll be getting something in the region of 50 to 60% extra damage, depending on exactly which models you're buffing and exactly what they're armed with. He actually provides the strongest buff with both of these effects in play on Sanguinary Guard with Power Fists, whose lower attacks get more out of Massive Doom, and the -1 to hit gets more out of the reroll to hits litany, which does have the new wording, which means that you can reroll those misses on a 3 that are only misses because of modifiers. To top that all off, he's also decently fighting in close combat with that Executioner's Axe, and he's very durable for his points, having an innate 2-up save, a Rosarius, and also 5 wounds. Again, I've not even taken into account his second litany, which could easily be the +2 to charges litany, or Mantra of Strength to soup him up in close combat, or indeed another close combat buff. He gives out some leadership buffs to nearby units and make Death Company fearless, but all of this goodness does come with a few downsides. You can potentially fail the litany or the roll for Massive Doom. Massive Doom is only once per battle, and you're really going to be wanting to start this guy on the tabletop, so he can use both of those litanies at the start of the battle round. Usually you will still be able to jump him out to meet an incoming Death Company squad coming in from reserve, if that's the game that you're wanting to play, as he does have pretty good movement, but it's not going to be quite as easy to meet a Death Company squad in the back of the deployment zone. But if you did want him with your deep striking reserves, you could use Wings of Sanguinius, allowing him to start on the board, cast those litanies, and then get over to the other side of the board to buff the units, say with the reroll hits and +2 to charge ones. So it does come with some significant caveats, but Astorath does give you the best numbers out of any of these guys out of the 9 that I'm looking at. Finally, we come on to our Librarian with a jump pack, who is quite expensive at 116 points. The spell that we're interested in him is Unleash Rage for +1 attack, which has a 72% chance to cast, as it's Warp Charge 6. I have factored in the chance of failing in with the maths of the damage output. On average, over the course of many games, he'll buff your Sanguinary Guard 24% on average, and less on the Death Company, due to them having more attacks to start with, so one extra attack being a bit less meaningful compared with having rerolls or something. As characters go, he's one of the least durable, but he doesn't have too bad melee with that force weapon of his. He can of course cast a second power. If you're looking purely for buffs, then that would be Shield of Sanguinius for a 5-up invul save, which certainly isn't too bad on Death Company, or could just smite if that would be more useful in your current situation. He can deny powers as well, which could certainly be helpful against some opponents, but one of his major weaknesses is that his power can get denied himself, which means that Unleash Rage will go off less than 72% of the time, because against some armies it's going to get denied. So that does reduce his efficiency as a close combat buffing guy just a little bit. So there we are, 9 fairly complicated characters reviewed. So let's see how they stack up when we compare their damage buffs to each other point for point. So in this table we're looking at their rough percentage damage increase versus the amount of points that they cost, and the metric is how much percent damage increase they get per 100 points of investment in that character. So obviously the cheaper characters come off better and the more expensive characters come off worse. Many of the characters had multiple values for percentage damage increase depending on which unit they were buffing, so for any of these I took a value that's in the middle of the various percentages that the maths spat out. We'll go through them in reverse order. First of all, we have the librarian, unfortunately, who only gives us a 17% damage output in total. Unleash Rage is by no means a bad power, but I'm not quite as much of a fan as librarians because their powers can fail, and Blood Angels just have so many more powerful options in terms of buffing close combat units. Next we have the captains and lieutenants, who do slightly more than the librarian, but they do have good close combat stats and also buff shooting, so despite their numbers being low, I believe that there's still very good reason to run these guys. Next up is the Sanguinor with an average of 19% per 100 points invested, and Dante, who comes out very slightly higher than him in terms of buffing per point, and of course both of these are fairly decently fighty Blood Angels characters. Their buffs in combat are really quite even, so between these guys I'd make my decision based on whether Dante's reroll of hits in the shooting phase is more important to you than being a slightly more efficient fighty character, which I believe that the Sanguinor is because he costs a few less points. In terms of buffing melee units, they are very, very similar indeed. Next up we have the Sanguinary Priest, and I've been assuming that he's buffing a strength 4 unit for this average of the amount of damage he's going to increase. The Sanguinary Priest is an interesting one because his bonus can be very much all or nothing depending on which target you're fighting. I think I'd only ever consider him if he was running alongside a strength 4 unit, as strength 4 is going to get the most damage increase out of that bonus of strength 5 to strength 6. So he's great to run alongside a big squad of Death Company with chainsaws or Sanguinary Guard with Oncoming swords. In some games against some opponents he might do very little, and in some games against other opponents he might be absolutely devastating. Next up, with almost the same increase, we have the Sanguinary Ancient. Those reroll 1s to wound are very nice, particularly when the character is quite so cheap and comes with good armour, a decent close combat weapon, and also the option of Standard of Sacrifice for points around the mid-60s. This guy is very good value indeed, and is certainly a very competitive Blood Angels option. In number 3 we have Lemartes himself. In this list we're assuming he's buffing Death Company, because why on earth would you run him with anything else? This guy is an incredibly good value for points character. He's fast, decently fighty, provides great buffs that work all the time, helps the Death Company reach combat with those rerolled charges, has a 4-up invul save for survivability, and frankly his litany on top of that is just added value for money. You could either start him on the board to use that litany, or just happily deep strike him alongside the Death Company. You will still get absolutely adequate value for those 100 points, even if you never bother to cast that litany all game. In second, we have a captain who's made a relic investment, so this guy's picked up those Quake Bolts for his Stormbolter, so now he's providing both +1 to hit, presuming he hits with those Quake Bolts, which he will 35 out of 36 times, and also reroll 1s to hit. Having 2 different buffs like this go off at the same time puts the amount of damage outputs that he increases the squad by absolutely through the roof, and it adds up to a 46% increase in damage. On top of being very fighty with that power fist I gave him, and decent survivability means he's a very solid pick. Obviously the Quake Bolts are only useful against one target, so it's much better served when you're deciding to absolutely decimate one squad, or one big heavy hitter with your unit rather than mopping up multiple units of chaff or something. Having to pay the command point for a relic is another downside, but you can see the results it gets with these numbers. And finally, king of the list, we have Astorath himself, though this is assuming that we're using his Massive Doom effect, which is only usable for 1 turn. That being said, Blood Angels units will often just have one key turn where they absolutely need to decimate a few units of the enemy's army with one big charge, and for just over 100 points, this plus his reroll aura will turn out your deep striking angels up to 11, as you have a very decent chance of getting both of these buffs off. He's also incredibly fighty himself and has another litany that we haven't even taken account for in the maths, though we have already mentioned some of his negatives and drawbacks. Overall, from making this video, it's made me realise just how valuable the named chaplains can be compared with their contemporaries. For me, the top 4 on the list are the most appealing for me if I want to buff a deep striking unit of Death Company or Sanguinary Guard. I was a little surprised at just how comparatively underwhelming the Sanguinor was, as that +1 attack aura certainly feels incredibly powerful. But I suppose one of the advantages of him is that his buff can be added to any of the other guys' buffs and have some decent synergy. As it says at the bottom of this slide, obviously there are many other factors to consider when you're looking at these units. You can't just reduce it down to 1% damage increase number and leave it at that, but it certainly is one of the helpful things to think about. I'd really like to hear your guys' thoughts on the various different buffing characters. If your Blood Angels have achieved some incredible feats under the guidance of one or more of these guys, I'd like to hear about it, so please let me know down in the comments. As I said, this will be the last Blood Angels video for a little while. We're going to be moving on to look at some Dark Angels and Guard in the near future, in addition to our regular Space Marines content, though I will certainly be making some more videos on Blood Angels on a bit more of an irregular basis, so if you have any more ideas for good videos, please let me know. Thanks for listening to Auspex Tactics. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more like this, or to support me on Patreon if you're finding my videos handy. Doing all this math hammer certainly takes a significant amount of time, so any support for the efforts are certainly appreciated. Thanks again for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.